I have a farm near Gundawindi. My husband and I bought our farm 8 years ago, and it feels like every second industry email we get, or every second event that comes through, carbon is on the agenda. So bear with me while I try and give you a few insights as to what I've learned in the last few years. So I guess a couple of years ago, I was pretty confused about carbon. I was looking at whether or not there was opportunities on our farm to do a soil carbon project under the Australian Carbon Credit Unit Scheme, or the ACU scheme, which is the federal government carbon credit program. And I was looking into that, trying to understand how will it work, is it worth it, can we make money from this, is it an alternative income stream? At the same time, there seemed to be noise coming through saying, you need to know your number, you need to know your carbon footprint for the supply chain. So it was really me trying to work out, well, what's the right thing to do here? How do I know who to trust? What's going on? And so I was then thinking, well, what's happening around the world? Because surely there's somewhere around the world that has this stuff figured out. Not so sure they do after doing a bit of travel, but anyway. So before I get started, show of hands if you've ever used one of the carbon calculators you can use online. So NLA, Ruminati, the AIA. Yep, okay. Anyone else want to put their hand up if they've either registered or been interested in doing a soil carbon or vegetation project? Okay, so a few hands as well. So there's probably a few people in the room who may know a little bit more than me. So disclaimer, I'm not a scientist, I'm not an economist, I'm a farmer and an extension officer. But what I did, I went and applied for a Nuffield Scholarship. For those that aren't familiar, Nuffield Farming Scholarships are experiential leadership programs where scholars receive funding to travel to countries of interest to research a topic. So my topic was around, is measuring carbon on farm good for business? Because really, at the end of the day, if we want to have viable, sustainable businesses, we can't just make decisions because it sounds good or because the government says we need to be carbon neutral by 2050 or we need to be reducing emissions, because it doesn't make sense as a farmer to do it if it means I'm going to go out the back door. So, as I said, my question, which I was trying to understand, was, is tracking carbon good for business? But the extension officer in me also wanted to know, so who's supporting farmers to do this, and where are they getting their information, and what are some of the policies, the frameworks, the initiatives globally that are helping farmers to engage, and are they engaging? So what I found from doing research in Australia and trying to look overseas as well is that there's two main ways that farmers engage in carbon farming. One is through carbon projects. So the ACU scheme is what we usually use in Australia. And in this part of the world, probably the most common one would be a soil carbon project. And the other way that people were engaging was by measuring and managing carbon footprint. So looking at your emissions on farm, looking at how you can store or how you can sequester carbon as well, and then using that information to A, inform the supply chain, but also B, make better decisions because you understand the efficiencies that you can make in your business by having that data. So another question, has anyone in the room been asked by their supply chain to provide their scope 1 or their scope 2 emissions? So scope 1 are emissions on farm, one hander. Scope 2 is emissions on farm being fertiliser use, fuel, methane from cattle, and then scope 2 is electricity, so emissions from electricity. Righto. So, I tried, as you can imagine, you could pretty much go anywhere in the world with this topic, which was good, but also a bit of a challenge because I definitely did not have unlimited budget or unlimited time. I ended up heading to a few different countries. I think I went to 11 total, but some of the the ones that really spoke to me particularly were in Canada. So those of you who have been to Alberta, the province of Alberta, has quite a significant oil and gas industry. So the landscape is dotted with oil and gas rigs all over the countryside. So in 2008, they set up a provincial carbon market called the Alberta Emissions Offset Scheme to help offset the emissions from those industries. So similar to Australia, there were methodologies set up around reducing emissions or sequestering carbon, and farmers could apply to earn carbon credits under that program. It was fairly early one, and good on them for having a really good go. There were probably a few gaps, like in hindsight, in some of those methodologies. Junk credits would have been sold. Farmers didn't always benefit, but some farmers did. So it's all about progress. It's not about perfection. So I think what they're doing, as similar to the Australian system, they are reviewing some of those methodologies. When those methodologies aren't fit for purpose, they either change them or they stop them. So Canada was a really interesting one. In the UK, they have only a couple of sort of government, I guess, administered methodologies, the Peatland Restoration Code and the Woodland Code. Interestingly, a farmer in the UK said to me, well, I feel like farmers here aren't necessarily going to go and work under these codes because we've got a subsidy system where we can get paid per hectare to have a soil management plan. Don't think they called it a subsidy system. I might be calling it a subsidy system. We get paid to have per hectare to have a soil management plan, or we get paid per hectare to build a hedgerow or to have a buffer strip to encourage beneficial insects. So it's much easier for a farmer to engage in that and get some alternative income and have a viable business by doing that than it is to have a carbon project. So I thought that was a really interesting observation. The USA, the example I went to was a really large cattle business. They had registered 2 carbon projects probably 2 years ago now, under an international standard. So we have the Australian Carbon Credit Unit Scheme, the Australian one. There's a couple of international ones as well, and one of the more well-known ones is called the Vera scheme, which is what they used. So they hadn't got carbon credits yet, and they still don't have those credits. However, they were using extensive soil carbon testing to inform where to put that project, and then doing high density, high rotation, long rest grazing in order to meet the requirements of that carbon market. So they were looking at not only having alternative income from having carbon credits to sell, they were also improving ground cover, improving soil carbon, improving soil health, improving productivity and profitability. So some really interesting experiences globally. Australia, I don't know, some of you may know this, but the Australian ACCU scheme, which is the federal government program, is really unique. I left Australia thinking, oh well, there'll be ones in the UK, the USA, they'll all have the equivalent of the ACCU scheme. Turns out they don't. What we've got is quite unique, and what we've got actually has a lot more scientific rigour and is a lot more robust than a lot of the international schemes. So the soil carbon project methodology in Australia, for example, is on its 4th iteration. It's not a set and forget, this looks like a good thing, let's just do this. They continually review and adjust to make them fit for purpose. So whilst we're really good at probably giving ourselves a hard time because we think we don't have a really good system, globally, I think we actually have one of the best systems. So the other part of what I talked about and what I looked into was measuring your carbon footprint on farm to try and understand how you can use that data to make better decisions, but also how you can inform the supply chain if they are asking. Often the supply chain aren't actually asking yet, but if and when they do, if you've got this data, you are well placed to be able to provide that information. So in Canada, the federal government put over $700 million over 4 years towards a project called the On-Farm Climate Action Fund, where farmers could apply for funding to either improve grazing through rotational grazing, so water and wire. They could apply for funding to reduce nitrous oxide emissions by managing fertiliser input on farm, and the other one was around cover cropping. So I had a farmer in Prince Edward Island, that's for cows. She applied for the funding. She was able to get the funding so she could improve her property to have water and wire and rotational grazing so that she could improve productivity, and in doing so improve her profitability by able to manage grazing and carrying capacity and stocking rates. In the UK, it was a bit of a different system. I met some producers who were dairy farmers for a big organic dairy called Arla. So that they were using a platform where they were putting their information through onto on sustainability, so not just carbon, looking at animal welfare as well and environmental impacts. And by doing that, they'd been doing it for 6 years. By having that data and putting it in and understanding their emissions and understanding their impact, they were able to get a 2p per litre price premium on their milk, which is a pretty impressive premium to have, an advantage to have. And then I also met with a consultant. That consultant worked with big companies, one of which was called Dawn Dumbia. It's a meat processor. That they worked with, I think, 500 of Dawn Dumbia's producers to measure their carbon footprint on farm. So from doing that, that consultant was also able to identify, well, where are the gaps? Where can you make efficiencies? Is it in feed efficiencies? Is it in other aspects of your farm? And how can you improve that in the future? So by having that support to measure your carbon footprint, but also use that information to monitor it to make better informed decisions for your farm business, they were able to make more efficiencies on farm. Well, that was a really interesting model. And as I said, in the USA, Matador Ranch was the one that had the 2 registered soil projects. They went above and beyond, and they monitored more soil carbon than they probably needed to help them understand where they could make improvements on farm and how they could do that. They also did an Asparagopsis trial. So we've heard a lot about Asparagopsis over the last few years. They did a grazing trial. It was very small, 25 head. They did say there were improvements or reduction in methane emissions from those cattle without any productivity impacts. However, I've also spoken with farmers in Australia, dairy farmers who have used Asparagopsis, and at a certain point of having Asparagopsis in their trial, it impacts appetite, and so weight gain falls off. So feed additives are definitely something that there's a lot of science going into that to make sure that they are valuable and worthwhile. But it was interesting to talk to the farmers in the USA about their trial and some of the things they were using to help improve how they do business and how profitable their business is. I visited, so yes, I could have visited countries just like Australia all over the world, but I also wanted to visit countries that are very different from Australia, because we often have preconceived ideas and we talk about some of the barriers we have. I wanted to try and understand what are the barriers in countries where literacy levels are low, where income levels are low, where there's political instability, or whether it's just a different market and a different supply chain. Uruguay was actually in South America, just near Brazil. It has no net zero targets, interestingly. However, I met with the government. They were working on programs to try and encourage farmers to start improving the way they manage their grazing so they could improve soil health and improve the way they manage their herd through let's say, pre-testing or culling empty cows, because they saw the importance of doing that to reduce emissions or sequester carbon of the cow herd, because they are so dependent on international trade. The beef market in Uruguay is their second biggest export, behind forestry, which by chance is a eucalyptus forest, mostly in Uruguay. Interestingly, Uruguay doesn't have a Department of Agriculture, they have a Department of Livestock, which just reflects how important the beef industry is for that country. So talking about a lot of the farmers in Uruguay set stops, so it was really a challenge for the government and for industry groups to try and get farmers to understand how maybe managing grazing through rotational or time-controlled grazing would actually benefit their business. So there were definite challenges in Uruguay about improving how or changing how things have traditionally been done. I did visit a carbon neutral beef farm who sold 5% of their carbon neutral beef at a premium to Switzerland, and the rest of it went to China as just standard beef. But that was one example of where they were using the data on farm to prove that they were carbon neutral to then get a price premium and to get market access. Vietnam was not a place where there were a lot of cattle. Rice farmers, typically 1 hectare rice farms in the Mekong Delta is where I went to, that's your average. So also lower literacy rates, probably lower incomes. The government has a net zero by 2050 target, like Australia, which is an interesting target to have for a country like that. But anyway, that's what it is. And they have a government policy of 1 million hectares of low emissions sustainable rice. So for them and those countries, not a beef example, but an example of where government's setting policy, which is then going to impact how farmers do what they do, what they need to look at, and then understanding, well, how can reducing emissions on my rice farm, for example, mean that I not only am helping work towards government policy, which isn't why we should be doing it, by the way, but it's actually about how's that improving efficiencies on my farm and making it a more long-term viable business for me. So I talked about before the subsidy system in the UK, which is actually called the Sustainable Farming Incentive. So as I said, it's about why we'll be involved in carbon markets when the Sustainable Farming Incentive is easier. That's an attitude in the UK. Talking to farmers in North America, farmers should be rewarded for what we do. We should be rewarded. So definitely those are the sorts of attitudes that are coming through around price premiums. Interestingly, I spoke to a beef farmer in the north of Scotland who, through government and industry initiatives, had 10 years worth of carbon accounts for their farm. They did it for a few reasons. One was she said, I can't throw stones from the outside if I don't understand how the system works. So that was a pretty clever approach. So she was involved. But also, she said, having this information means that I can make better decisions. I understand when it isn't worth me buying fert to put out because the gains we're getting don't outweigh the cost. And having that 10 years of data really helps me understand my business and understand how that can make me make better decisions on farm. And I did speak to a couple of producers who were saying, we're doing this, not getting a premium yet. We like to think in the future we will. So I think there's a lot of noise coming from the supply chain saying we now have climate-related financial disclosure, which came in January 1. We need to report our emissions. We need to report our impacts on the climate. I think they're saying this is what we need to do, but the actual doing, there's a gap. And so I think while there's a gap, the pressure's off. But when they work out how they're going to fill that gap, I wonder if the pressure will increase to farmers. And the questions might be asked, have you got data that you can support how we should be preferentially buying your beef, for example? 5? I'm nearly finished. So one thing we talked about was consider the trade-offs. Not everything is good for business. So don't do it just because Everyone's saying, well, we need to track emissions, we need to reduce emissions. If, for example, you want to reduce emissions and you're cropping or you're planting oats, and so the easiest way to reduce emissions in that is to drop a fertiliser. But if that means you're not getting a yield, or that means you haven't got any profit, it's something that we really need to think about. So don't do it just because everyone's saying you need to. Really think about how it impacts your business and where it makes good business sense. I talked before about the attitudes. So one thing I've seen that's really common around the world, the motivations of farmers don't change. Money, we need to be viable. Time, how long does it take to do something, but also how long does it take to get a return? And then sustainability. If you are from a wealthy country, you can afford to probably make decisions around environmental sustainability on your farm. I think it would be a different case if you're a rice farmer in Vietnam, where the difference between the decisions are either sustainability or food on the table. You can know which one's going to win every day of the week. But the enablers and the barriers in each country are where things change. So we're looking at policy changes, the frameworks and the models that are in place in different countries, climate in a country, the history of that country, and culture as to whether or not things are adopted, whether or not people pay attention, and the type of actions they place on and the things they do on farm. So my takeaways, think about what you're already doing on farm to reduce emissions. Find the low-hanging fruit. There were talks before about how are you improving your weaning rates, for example. What are the easy things you can do on farm that mean you're either sequestering carbon or reducing emissions? So thinking about what can you do to improve soil health or potentially increase soil carbon. It is progress over perfection. I think if we try to go for perfection, we're going to lose out every time. So let's just keep progressing as we go. Reducing emissions or storing carbon on farm can increase profitability and can increase efficiencies, but just be aware when it doesn't. And there's no silver bullet that I've found anyway. So it's around stacking actions or activities is where you have an impact. It's not about doing one thing, it's about looking at your whole farm business holistically and working out how the little things can have a cumulative effect. And being informed to make decisions that best suit your farm. Context is key.